It was a calm and quiet morning, the kind where the sun shone through the trees just right, and the breeze was soft, barely making the leaves rustle. Sarah Clark stepped out of her small apartment, her cane gently tapping the ground ahead of her. She took a slow, steady breath, listening to the world around her. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sound of distant footsteps on the sidewalk echoed. It seemed like just another ordinary day, a day like any other. Or at least, that's what anyone who didn't know her might have thought. Sarah had always been an ordinary woman to most people. She was a frail figure, always dressed in simple clothes. Her long, dark hair was tied back into a loose ponytail, and her glasses were often perched on the bridge of her nose, though she couldn't see through them. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and careful, just as they had been for years. To the world, Sarah was nothing more than a blind woman with a cane, trying to get through each day with a quiet, unassuming life. But what most people didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Sarah was far from ordinary. She had a story, a history that no one could see with a glance. Her life wasn't as simple as it seemed, and the gentle tapping of her cane wasn't just a sign of her blindness. It was a sound that marked a journey, one filled with pain, strength, and secrets. As Sarah made her way down the path through the park, she passed a group of people chatting on a bench. They looked at her for a moment, and then turned away. Some might have felt sympathy, others simply saw her as someone they didn't need to pay attention to. She was just another blind woman, after all. No one could see the fierce determination in her heart, or the quiet strength that lay behind her soft, unassuming smile. But she wasn't bothered by their ignorance. She had learned long ago that people who didn't understand her wouldn't be the ones to help her rise. At her side, trotting confidently along, was her guide dog, a large, imposing German shepherd named Max. Max wasn't just any dog, and Sarah was well aware of that. His movements were precise, his muscles rippling beneath his sleek coat. His eyes, though calm, held an intensity that could make anyone pause. Max wasn't just her guide, he was something more. She had trained him herself, working with him for months on end, teaching him skills no one would expect a dog to know. His calm exterior hid the truth. Max had been trained for combat, trained to protect and fight if necessary. People couldn't know this, of course. To them, he was just a guide dog, an animal helping Sarah navigate the world she couldn't see. But Max was far more than that. He was a weapon, silent and ready, if the need ever arose. Today, Sarah was walking to the park as usual, her fingers lightly brushing against the rough bark of the trees as she passed. She could hear the sound of people laughing, children playing in the distance. It was peaceful, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind. She wasn't sure why, but something told her that today might not be as calm as the others. Perhaps it was the unusual quiet in the air, or the strange energy that seemed to hum just beneath the surface. Whatever it was, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. But she would face it, just as she had always faced every challenge before head-on, with strength and courage. As she walked deeper into the park, she noticed a group of bikers parked near the fountain. They were loud and boisterous, laughing among themselves, their heavy bikes rumbling in the background. The bikers didn't pay her much attention at first. After all, she was just a blind woman walking her dog. But Sarah could feel their eyes on her. She didn't need to see them to know they were watching, sizing her up. She could hear their hushed whispers, the smirks in their voices. One of them, a tall man with tattoos running up his arms, called out in a mocking tone. "Hey, lady, what's with the dog? You planning on taking him for a ride, or is he just your pet?" The other bikers laughed, their voices carrying in the still air. Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard these types of comments before. It was nothing new. People often underestimated her, thinking she was weak because of her blindness. They didn't realize that every word, every sneer, only made her stronger. It was one of the many things she had learned throughout her life. People who didn't understand her often made the mistake of thinking they could push her around. But they had no idea what she was truly capable of. Max stopped beside her, his ears flicking toward the bikers. His body stiffened, but Sarah gently placed a hand on his back, signaling him to remain calm. She knew her dog's training well, and she knew he would only act if she gave the command. But she also knew the bikers didn't know that. They didn't realize that the dog at her side was no ordinary guide dog. Max was a trained fighter, a protector. He had been through missions that most people could never imagine, protecting those who needed him most. Sarah gave Max a small, quiet nod, signaling him to move forward. They would continue their walk, just as they always did. But she couldn't help the small feeling of anticipation that rose within her. She knew something was about to change. It wasn't just the bikers. It was the world around her. Today, the calm would be shattered. As they moved past the bikers, Sarah could hear their footsteps follow. They were getting closer now, their laughter growing louder, their words more daring. Sarah felt a shift in the air, a sense that things were about to get out of hand. But she remained steady. She knew that she and Max were prepared for whatever might come their way. The bikers weren't just making fun of her, they were challenging her. But Sarah Clark wasn't the kind of woman to back down. She had a secret, one that not even they could see. And when the time came, they would learn just how wrong they were to underestimate her. The day was about to take a turn, and Sarah and Max would face it together. In that moment, as Sarah and her dog continued walking, there was no fear in her heart. Only certainty. Today, the world would learn who she really was. And those who had mocked her, those who had thought they could get away with it, were about to discover the truth. The truth that Sarah Clark wasn't someone to be taken lightly. And Max, her loyal companion, would show them exactly why. Sarah had always been the target of mocking stares. It was something she had grown used to over the years, but today, something felt different. As she walked through the park, the sound of laughter and loud voices made her pause for a moment. She had felt it before, the weight of unwanted attention, but this time, there was something unsettling about it. The bikers at the fountain were watching her, and it wasn't the casual glance that people usually gave a blind woman. No, this was different. Their stares were filled with mockery, and their voices carried an edge of cruelty that she hadn't encountered in a while. She could hear them before she even saw them. Their motorcycles revved loudly, creating a buzzing sound that filled the air. The smell of gasoline lingered around them like a thick cloud, and she could sense the confidence in their steps. These weren't the type of people who would show her kindness, and Sarah knew it. They were tough, proud, and loud, and they saw her as nothing more than a frail, blind woman. As Sarah continued to walk past them, one of the bikers let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Hey, lady. What's with the dog? You sure you can handle that beast, or is it just for show?" His words rang out, cutting through the quiet atmosphere of the park. Sarah's grip on Max's leash tightened. She didn't flinch. She had heard this kind of comment many times before. It was the same thing people always said when they saw her walking with her dog. They couldn't understand. They didn't know the first thing about her, and yet they felt the need to ridicule her. But today, it wasn't just the usual comment. The laughter felt sharper, more biting. "Yeah, right," another biker added. "What's he gonna do? Lead you into a tree?" They all laughed, and Sarah could hear them looking at each other, sharing in their amusement. It wasn't just the words, they were treating her like she didn't belong. Like she was something to laugh at. Max, sensing his handler's unease, stopped beside her. He wasn't reacting the way a normal guide dog would. His muscles were tense, his ears flat against his head. He was alert, his body prepared to act if necessary. But Sarah said nothing. She kept her hand on his back, gently guiding him forward. She had trained him well, and she knew he was ready for anything. But now wasn't the time for Max to show his strength. Not yet. "Looks like your dog's lost," one of the bikers shouted. The others chuckled, their voices laced with amusement. "Maybe you should get a new one. This one doesn't seem to know where it's going." The comments continued, each one more hurtful than the last, but Sarah kept walking. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. She knew their type. They were used to seeing weakness, and they thought they could push her around. But she wasn't the kind of woman who would let that happen. The more they mocked her, the more determined she became to ignore them. Still, as they followed her, their voices growing louder, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The tension in the air had changed. The bikers weren't just making fun of her, they were following her now, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, the way the park, once peaceful and calm, seemed to grow heavier with each step. The sound of the motorcycles revving up, the laughter fading in and out, everything about the moment felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Max's ears twitched, and Sarah felt the subtle shift in his posture. He was ready. She knew that. Max was always ready to protect her, but she also knew that her dog's training wasn't just for show. It was serious. Max had been trained for situations that most people would never understand. He wasn't just a guide dog, he was a trained force, prepared to defend Sarah if necessary. But right now, she wasn't going to give them the chance to see that. She had to stay calm. She had to be the one in control. One of the bikers stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Sarah stopped in her tracks. She could hear the smirk in his voice as he spoke. "What's the matter, lady? Too scared to walk past us? Or maybe you're afraid of your own dog?" He laughed again, and the others joined in, their voices echoing through the park. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing steady. She could feel Max's body tense beside her, but she wasn't ready yet. Not until she knew what they were really after. She had a plan, but it wasn't time to reveal it. Not yet. The biker continued to taunt her, his voice growing louder and more confident. "You know, you're in the wrong part of town, sweetheart. Maybe you should head back before things get ugly. I'm sure you don't want to find out how ugly things can get." His words were harsh, but Sarah didn't react. She knew that the moment she showed weakness, they would pounce. That was what they wanted her to be afraid, to show that she was scared. But she wasn't scared. She was prepared. Max was trained for moments like this, and he could sense the danger. He wasn't just a guide dog, he was a guardian, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. But Sarah had trained him to follow her lead. She wouldn't let him act unless it was absolutely necessary. "Leave her alone," a voice suddenly cut through the tension. It was sharp, clear, and full of authority. The biker in front of Sarah turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw who had spoken. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, walking toward them. His presence seemed to change the atmosphere instantly. The bikers paused, their mocking voices faltering for just a second. Sarah didn't recognize him, but she could tell he was different. There was something about him that made the bikers hesitate. The man didn't look like he was afraid of them. In fact, he looked like he could handle them without breaking a sweat. He walked with a quiet confidence, his eyes locking onto the biker who had been taunting Sarah. The biker didn't know it yet, but this man was a force to be reckoned with. He wasn't just a random passerby, he had his own strength, his own story, and something told Sarah that the bikers were about to learn something they hadn't bargained for. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The tension between the bikers and the stranger hung in the air, thick and palpable. Sarah could feel it in her chest, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. She didn't know who the man was, but she had a feeling that today was going to be a turning point. The bikers, for all their bravado, were starting to realize that they had underestimated Sarah. They thought she was an easy target, just another blind woman walking her dog. But they hadn't known about Max, and they hadn't known about Sarah. They didn't understand that the true strength of a person doesn't always show on the outside. And Sarah? She wasn't about to let them find out the hard way. Not yet. The conflict had only just begun, and Sarah Clark was about to show the bikers just how wrong they were to underestimate her. The bikers didn't stop. They grew bolder as Sarah walked on, mocking her every step. They thought it was funny, making jokes about her blindness and her dog, assuming she couldn't hear them. But Sarah heard every word. She had learned to hear things most people didn't even notice. The sound of their tires on the gravel, the laughter that echoed through the park, the click of their boots as they moved closer. It was all too loud, too clear, and it made Sarah's pulse quicken. Her hand tightened on the leash, feeling Max's steady presence beside her. Max had been with her for years. He had been by her side through every challenge, every moment of doubt, every dangerous situation. But today felt different. The bikers weren't just mocking her, they were getting too close. They were invading her space, making her feel cornered. She didn't show it, though. She kept walking, moving with the same calm, measured steps. The sounds of their voices behind her only grew louder, more taunting. "Come on, lady, are you lost?" one of them called out. "Need help getting across the street? Or are you waiting for a taxi?" Sarah didn't reply. She kept walking, and Max kept walking with her, his steps steady and strong. But Sarah could feel the change in the air. The bikers were no longer just talking, they were blocking her path, forcing her to stop. One biker stepped directly in front of her, laughing as he looked down at her. "Hey, what's the matter? Can't you see me?" he sneered. Max's ears twitched. Sarah could feel his body tense, his muscles coiling like a spring. She knew him well enough to sense that he was ready. But she wasn't ready yet. Not until they pushed her further. Max had been trained for moments like this, but she had learned patience. Patience was key. She had to wait for the right moment. The biker laughed louder, stepping even closer. "What are you gonna do, huh? Your dog gonna bite me?" he taunted. Sarah's heart beat a little faster, but she didn't let her nerves show. She focused on Max. She felt his steady breathing next to her, heard the way his paws barely made a sound on the ground. He was always aware, always alert. Every movement of his ears, every shift of his body was a sign, a warning to her. He wasn't just a guide dog. He was trained for situations like this. The biker's words grew more cruel, but Sarah kept walking, forcing herself to stay calm. She didn't want to reveal anything yet. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She knew the bikers were expecting her to be afraid, expecting her to crumble under their pressure. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She had been through too much to let a group of bikers scare her now. The biker in front of her didn't back down. Instead, he stepped even closer, his face now inches from hers. "You're just a blind lady with a dog, huh?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "What, you think you're special or something?" Sarah felt a shift in the air around her. Max's stance grew even more rigid. She could sense it. Something was about to happen. But she couldn't move just yet. Not until the right moment. The biker raised his hand as if to touch her, to push her back. But before he could make contact, Max moved. It was quick, too quick for anyone to follow. In an instant, Max had positioned himself between Sarah and the biker, his body tense and ready. The biker froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He hadn't expected it. He hadn't expected the dog to react like that. Max growled softly, a low rumble that echoed in the quiet park. The sound was deep, menacing, and it sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She had heard that growl before. It was a warning. The biker took a step back, his eyes darting from Max to Sarah, clearly taken aback by the dog's sudden aggression. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice shaking a little now. But Sarah didn't give him a chance to back down. She had waited long enough. It was time. With a steady hand, she grabbed Max's leash and pulled him forward. The biker stepped aside reluctantly, clearly not expecting the quick move. Sarah walked past him, the sound of her footsteps firm and determined. Max stayed close, his head turned slightly to watch the bikers as they backed off, still unsure of what to do. Sarah's heart was racing, but she didn't show it. She could feel the tension in the air, the way the bikers had suddenly become more cautious. They had thought she was just a helpless blind woman, but they hadn't counted on Max. They hadn't counted on her resilience. She kept walking, but she could hear the bikers whispering behind her. "What the hell was that?" one of them asked. "That dog's not normal." Max's growl had made them think twice. Sarah knew they would be cautious now. But she didn't let herself relax. She knew it wasn't over yet. The bikers hadn't given up. They were just waiting for the right moment to strike again. But as Sarah and Max moved further away, the bikers didn't follow. The tension in the air began to fade, but Sarah's mind was still alert. She could still hear them laughing, their voices distant now. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Sarah knew that she had just taken the first step in showing them that she wouldn't be bullied. But the real power wasn't in the dog. It was in Sarah. Max had been her guide and her protector for years, but she had always been the one to call the shots. She had learned to be strong, to stand her ground, no matter what. And the bikers were about to learn that lesson the hard way. As they moved further from the bikers, Sarah could feel the weight of their eyes still on her. She wasn't fooled by their silence. She knew they were watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. But Sarah wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. She kept walking, her head held high, her steps steady and confident. And Max walked right beside her, his presence a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. Sarah had endured mistreatment before, but this was different. The bikers had underestimated her. And now they were starting to realize they had made a mistake. They hadn't just messed with a blind woman and her dog. They had messed with someone who knew how to fight back, someone who had nothing to lose. The rising tension between them wasn't over yet. Sarah could feel it in her bones. But this time, she wasn't going to let it break her. She was ready. And soon, the bikers would find out just how wrong they were. The tension had been building for a while. Sarah could feel it in the air. The bikers were getting more aggressive, and their words were becoming more threatening. They had already tried to make her feel small, to treat her like she was weak. They had underestimated her, and now they were pushing her too far. As she walked with Max, she could hear the sounds of their footsteps getting closer. The mocking voices had stopped, replaced by a cold silence. The bikers were circling around her now, no longer content with just insults. They had thought that they could make fun of her, mess with her, and walk away unscathed. But Sarah wasn't just some easy target. She had a plan, and it was finally time to put it into action. One of the bikers, the one who had been the loudest, stepped forward. He was the one who had mocked her the most, laughing at her blindness and making cruel comments about her guide dog. He had gotten closer and closer, and now, his face was only a few inches from hers. Well, he sneered. "Looks like you're not going anywhere. You really think your dog is going to stop me?" The other bikers stood behind him, watching the scene unfold. They were waiting, curious to see how this would play out. But they weren't ready for what was about to happen. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She stayed calm, her face set in a calm expression, though inside she felt the fire starting to burn. She knew what was coming. She had been waiting for this moment. Max, standing by her side, was still. His muscles were tense, his ears sharp. He had been trained for moments like this, trained to react quickly, decisively. Sarah had been through this before. She had seen what Max could do when he was called to action. But today, it was going to be different. Today, Max would reveal just how powerful he truly was. The biker raised his hand, reaching for her arm as if he could push her away. But Sarah didn't move. Instead, she gave Max a single command. Just a whisper, a word that only he could hear. Go. In that split second, Max sprang into action. It was like watching a well-trained athlete move with lightning speed. The biker didn't even have time to react before Max was on him. The dog was fast, too fast for the biker to stop. Max leaped forward, his body a blur of muscle and power. Before the biker could even raise his arms to defend himself, Max's paw slammed into his chest. The force was so strong that the biker was knocked off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his helmet flying off, his hands reaching for the ground as he tried to push himself up. But it was too late. Max was already on top of him, his jaws wide, a low growl rumbling from his throat. The bikers who had been laughing moments before were silent now. They froze, their eyes wide with shock. They had thought they could push Sarah around, make fun of her, and now they were seeing the full force of what she had been hiding. The biker who had tried to touch her was now lying on the ground, struggling to get up, but Max was too fast, too powerful for him to escape. Sarah stood tall, her hands still on Max's leash, but her gaze was steady and unwavering. She had known all along what Max was capable of, but now, the bikers were learning just how dangerous it could be to mess with her. The others stepped back, their bravado fading away. The laughter had stopped. The taunting had ended. They were no longer in control of the situation. Max didn't move, his eyes locked on the biker beneath him, making sure he wouldn't get up. The biker's breath came in short gasps, his body trembling beneath the dog's weight. He looked up at Sarah, fear written all over his face. He had thought she was just a blind woman, helpless and weak. But now, he was the one who was helpless. Get him off me! The biker yelled, his voice shaking. But Sarah didn't respond immediately. She let the moment sink in, letting the bikers see how quickly things had changed. They had underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. She looked down at the biker beneath Max and spoke calmly, but with a cold edge in her voice. You should have thought twice before messing with me. Her words were steady, but they carried weight. They weren't just directed at the biker on the ground, they were meant for the others too. She wanted them to understand. She wanted them to realize that she wasn't someone to be messed with. Max stayed still, watching the other bikers carefully. They were all watching him now, their eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. They had seen his strength, his speed, his power. They had no idea that a dog could be trained to fight like that, to defend like that. The tension in the air was thick now. Sarah could feel it. The bikers were no longer laughing. They were no longer mocking her. They were afraid. The biker on the ground tried again to push Max off, but Max only growled louder, his body tense with warning. Sarah could feel the dog's muscles under her hand, his every movement controlled, focused. She knew Max wouldn't move unless she told him to, and she knew it wasn't time yet. The bikers needed to understand that messing with her came with consequences. Slowly, she stepped forward, and the bikers took a step back. They were afraid now. They weren't sure what to do. Sarah had been calm, unshaken, but they had seen what she was capable of. They had seen her strength, her determination, and the power of her dog. The biker on the ground, still struggling beneath Max, looked up at her with a mix of fear and confusion. You're not what I thought," he muttered, his voice low. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already proven everything she needed to prove. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. They weren't mocking her. They had learned their lesson. With a final glance at the fallen biker, Sarah turned and gave Max a quiet command. The dog immediately stepped back, his eyes still locked on the bikers as they scrambled to their feet. He didn't let them forget who was in charge. As Sarah walked away, she could hear the bikers muttering among themselves, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. They had learned that day that appearances could be deceiving, and underestimating someone was the biggest mistake they could make. Sarah and Max walked away from the scene, their steps steady, their heads held high. Sarah had shown the bikers who she really was. She was